I donate to charities that keep people like you away from society, because that's not approved. You're listening to Improv-ing Business on Web Talk Radio, where personal and business finances take a front row seat. I'm Brandon.
This is Rick.
And today, we'll be talking about transforming your business and your community through social change. Now, we've talked a little bit in other podcasts about the nitty-gritty of business, but today we're taking a broader picture of business by looking at the role of a company in social change from the community to the world. Our stories will include the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, the Northridge earthquake in 1994, and the current visionary plan of the company Cliff Bar.
Our first story starts with the 1970s and 1980s anti-apartheid movement at UCLA. But we are going to be looking at this from the consumer point of view.
For those who aren't historically minded or don't know about it, apartheid is the South African practice that started in 1949 of segregation across racial lines. South Africa had been colonized by the Dutch during the age of colonization, and it still had a large, but still a minority population of people descended from white Europeans. While the United States was getting out of the practice of segregation in the 1950s, South Africa started really doing so in force in 1948, and they began legislating this apartheid, which means separate in Afrikaans. Apartheid was opposed pretty much by everyone else except the South Africans for the better part of 50 years that it existed. And in 1991, the government of President F.W. de Klerk began to repeal most of the legislation that provided the basis for apartheid. Under this legislation, non-white South Africans were divided into their own separate neighborhoods and were required to have passes to exit these neighborhoods, as well as they weren't allowed to own land. And at a certain point, the land that they owned was forcibly taken away from them and sold on the cheap to white settlers. The non-white South Africans, basically through legislative trickery, had their voting rights taken away from them. And despite the fact that the United Nations and almost every other country roundly rejected this practice and said it was terrible, many companies still invested in South Africa and in South African interests.
But this practice did not fall on deaf ears with many students and universities. Some students in the UC system, including those at UCLA, my alma mater, tried to force the regents of the UC to divest their monies from companies that were doing business in South Africa. This story could be found in a book called UCLA: The First Century. The students tried several different methods to get the attention of the regents and the importance of not supporting corporations that were supporting such a repressive government. But in the 1980s, things started to really happen at UCLA. Some students told the LA Times they joined the movement because they resented being called do nothing, care nothing, out for ourselves, yuppies.
Which, as we talked about last podcast, is something literally every generation has said about the next generation, that they're do nothing, care nothings.
Only yours. The students started gaining popularity by doing such creative things as building Freedom City in front of Schomburg Hall. Now, this was a city that was put together, and in order to pass through it, you'd had to have a pass, like blacks would have to go through some of the large cities in South Africa.
What they called restricted zones, which was basically everything outside their neighborhoods that they were assigned to.
And so they were trying to give the students at UCLA an idea of what it's like to be black in South Africa and be restricted about your freedom. The UCLA students also built a shantytown at the foot of Bruin Walk, and then they would move that shanty town around campus in order to gain following.
If you're having trouble visualizing the sort of conditions that the non-white citizens had to be in, I would recommend the movie District 9. It's a science fiction film that's loosely based on apartheid, based off the District 6 in Cape Town, and it really does a good job showing the sort of conditions that people were put in. In this case, since it's a science fiction film, it's aliens are put in, but it's a good metaphor for how racial politics were going on at this time.